Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this AEI conversation. I'm Robert Doar, president of AEI, and I'm very glad to have both the outgoing and incoming chairman of the Republican Study Committee here this morning to talk with us about the coming Congress and their priorities. The Republican Study Committee, as many of you know, has been an influential center of conservative thinking and policy proposals for years. Current Vice President Pence and House Republican Whip Steve Scalise are former chairman. And AEI scholars often work with the Republican Study Committee on major issues. I have testified before the study committee and advised them on various issues concerning food security and poverty policy. We've had our China scholars talk to them about China. They are the emerging young leadership of the conservative movement in the United States, and we're very pleased to have both the outgoing chairman, Mike Johnson from Louisiana, and the incoming chairman, Jim Banks from Indiana. Mike Johnson from Louisiana and Jim Banks from Indiana. I'm going to do a quick introduction of both of them and then ask some questions, but we will take questions from the audience. And if you'd like to ask questions, please submit them to Chris Gavin, CHRIS.Gavin, Gavin, at AEI.org. And we'll put them up on the chat box and I'll try to forward them, although I have a bunch of my own questions as well. So we'll try to get to them as they come up. Brief introductions. Representative Jim Banks is the chairman-elect of the Republican Study Committee, and Representative Banks is in his second term representing the 3rd District of Indiana, covering the northeast corner of the state, including Fort Wayne. Representative Banks serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Education and Labor Committee, and the Veterans Affairs Committee. And like Congressman Johnson, he is a father of young children. So we always like to have know about people's families. And Representative Johnson, as the outgoing chairman of the RSC, Representative Johnson is in his second term representing the 4th District of Louisiana, covering the northwest part of the state, including Shreveport. Representative Johnson serves on the Judiciary Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. So I'd like to start with you, Representative Johnson. You've been the chairman for this past year. What did you accomplish? What are you most proud of your accomplishments at the RSC in the past year?
Yeah, Robert, thanks so much for having us, and greetings from Louisiana, where we are recovering from COVID. It's a real thing, and we had a tough Thanksgiving week, but we're on the mend and be back in DC soon. This was a very, we feel, productive 2 years for the Republican Study Committee. You know, the RSC was founded back in 1973, and it was labeled at that time, referred to as the intellectual arsenal of conservatism in the House. And it's kind of operated over the years as a policy shop where our conservative philosophy makes its way into legislation, where we put that onto paper. We develop an agenda to move forward in the Congress. It's difficult to do that when you're in the minority, as we all know, and that's where we found ourselves these last 2 years. But we decided when I became chairman, and I committed to our group. By the way, we have 148 members in this current Congress, so it's the largest caucus of conservatives and Republicans in Congress. And when I got the group together and I said, y'all, we're going into the minority, we understand that. And there's this sort of idea that some people have that when you're in the minority in the House, that you just wander in the wilderness for 2 years and downshift. I said, we're going to do exactly the opposite. I would like to propose to you all that we spend this next 2 years really with our hands at the wheel, the axe to the grind, pick your metaphor, but we're going to work very, very hard. We're going to realign what we do here at the RSC. And my vision is to sort of trim the fat, get rid of all the many, many task forces that we have. For example, Robert, we had a Second Amendment task force in RSC on which every single member was assigned, and they rarely met or did much of anything. So that was just one example. We trimmed the fat, so to speak. We narrowed our focus down to just a handful, 7 task forces. And we separated the membership into those task forces, populating each one with between 12 and 15 members. And the charge was this: we're going to develop actual policy from each of these groups: the National Security and Foreign Affairs Task Force, the Government Efficiency, Accountability, and Reform Task Force, the Budget and Spending Task Force. We had the American Worker Task Force, our Healthcare Task Force. And so we did exactly that. I'm gonna hold up to you a little visual aid here, Robert. This is our, we call this the Conservative Playbook, and it's a compilation of all that work that we did over 2 years. It's 330-page policy manual where each of these task forces came out with publications, 50, 60, 70 pages each over the course of 2 years, where we have real sound orthodox conservative solutions to all the greatest challenges facing America. This is our playbook to run when we get our governing moment. We think we're going to have that in 2022, and our team's ready to go.
So you've laid the groundwork. Now, Representative Banks, what are your goals for the coming year?
Well, likewise, thank you, Robert. Thank you to AEI for hosting this. AEI hasn't just been very important to me as a member and to my staff, educating us on a number of policy issues. But as you said, AEI has been a great partner with Republican Study Committee for a long time. And we look forward to building upon that partnership and relationship for the next couple of years. I'm very proud to become the chairman of RSC and follow in the footsteps of my great friend, Mike Johnson from Louisiana. But there's a strong Hoosier legacy within the Republican Study Committee. As you mentioned, Vice President Mike Pence was chairman of this group a decade ago. And before him, other Hoosiers like Dan Burton and my friend David McIntosh were chairs of this influential group as well. And I hope to do this job half as well as what Mike Johnson and many of those others have done this in the past, to be chairman of this strong, influential conservative body in the House. As Mike said, he's laid the groundwork. Mike, you didn't just say we're in the minority. There's nothing we can do. And we're going to sit on our hands over the last term. Mike Johnson and RSC over the last 2 years has mapped out a roadmap of where we're going to go when we win back the majority. Now we have another 2 years of the minority, but we can taste the majority. We're just a few seats shy of winning back the majority in the House. And Robert, I really believe Republicans will win back the House in 2 years. And one way that RSC is going to play a role in us winning back the majority is RSC needs to be in the fight. And I want to lead us into the fight in a number of areas, but a few areas that are really important in exposing how radical the left has taken over the Democrat Party, and juxtapose that with where the Republicans are, where I think most of America is. And a few of those issues would be right out of the gate. The fight to preserve and protect the Hyde Amendment will be one of those major initiatives that Republican Study Committee will lead in educating the American people about how important the Hyde Amendment has been for a generation in saving unborn babies and preventing our taxpayer dollars from going to fund abortion. RSC will be on the front lines of exposing how radical the Democrats have become. What was once bipartisan, what presidents from Jimmy Carter to Bill Clinton to Joe Biden have defended and supported in the Hyde Amendment is no longer supported by the Democrat Party today. So that's a fight that we're going to engage in right out of the gate. The second fight will be preserving the Trump era defense budgets. What President Trump did over the last 4 years to rebuild the military is significant. And Democrats now are telling us that they want to cut military spending substantially right out of the gate at the beginning of the new administration next year. We can't allow that to happen as we fell behind before, and now we've caught back up with our chief adversaries in China and Russia, others, by rebuilding the military, getting back to where we are with significant defense budgets. We can't afford to cut it. RSC's legacy issue has been balancing the budget and fiscal responsibility. We're going to be out there just like we always have before on that issue. But Robert, the big area where I think we have to move that's different for the conservative movement before, what President Trump has taught us in marrying the populist ideals of President Trump with the traditional conservative issues. Those are new areas where I want RSC to engage in. One area would be big tech free speech censorship, Section 230 reforms. That's an area where I see RSC being heavily engaged in. And then also the China subject, which I know we're going to talk more about in this during this Zoom call as well, being on the front lines of being out there and challenging China, holding China accountable. That's something that RSC will engage in heavily as well.
So I want to follow up on that comment about marrying the two strains of conservatism represented by President Trump and maybe more traditional conservatism, and the question of the debt and deficit and entitlements. And sticking with you, Representative Banks, are you, when you talk about debt and deficit and spending constraints, are you talking about Medicare and Social Security, which President Trump always said he was untouchable? Is entitlement reform and constraining the growth of these big commitments to retirees, is that no longer a part of the Republican Study Committee's agenda, or where are we on that?
It's definitely a part of our agenda. And this last term, Chairman Johnson gave me the honor of chairing the Budget and Spending Task Force for RSC, and we put forward the only budget that came anywhere in the House came from RSC, and it was a balanced budget that balanced in 6 years, and we tackled Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and made reforms to those programs as part of an effort to show our colleagues that you really can balance the budget. The president's budget proposal balanced in about 12 years. Our budget proposal balanced in half that amount of time. I think we can all agree that it will never be more difficult to put forth a balanced budget than now, after what we've gone through with the pandemic and all of the stimulus spending that we've passed over the past 6 to 8 months. But RSC, once again, is going to be out there and showing the rest of our colleagues that it can be done, and we will present a budget proposal just like we always have in the first half of 2021.
And Congressman Johnson, you said at the start of this that the pandemic is a real thing. You know it because you have suffered from it, and your colleagues in the Senate, and I think your colleague Tom Reed from New York also yesterday joined a group putting out an emergency stimulus package of about $1 trillion. Where would the RSC be on that, or getting that done quickly during the lame duck session?
Well, I think there's a broad recognition amongst conservatives in the House and the Senate that the American people need some relief. What we have been focused on is wanting to double down on the programs that we knew were efficient and worked, the Paycheck Protection Program, some of the things related to that, because we know that it had the desired effect. I mean, in my district alone, we can count hundreds of thousands of jobs that were saved because of the Paycheck Protection Program. It was an extreme measure taken by the government, but we could justify that in accordance with our conservative philosophy, because remember, it was the government that shut the economy down, this unprecedented event. And so it needed a proper response. So we would invest in that again, because we see that truly as a wise investment. It kept employees attached to their employers, and it kept people working. Those funds have long since been exhausted, and they're running out. And there are a number of small businesses that are the lifeblood of our economy in my district and so many others that frankly won't survive through this holiday if they don't have a little bit extra that they could qualify for. Now, the Senate proposal early on, several months back, and many of the iterations of this said that if a business could show more than a 50% drop in revenue over previous year, then they might qualify for another round of PPP. There's some reasonable measure there, some objective standard that could be used. And so I think there's a broad bipartisan consensus to do something like that. The problem we've had is that up to this point, Pelosi, Schumer, and the Democrats have wanted to load it up like a Christmas tree with all sorts of things totally unrelated to the COVID-19 crisis. And the problem is, Robert, as you know, and we keep kind of weaving back, the central theme of all this is this enormous debt that the country has incurred through COVID. And of course, prior to that, we're over $27 trillion now. This is something that should keep every one of us up at night, because you can't kick that can down the road forever, and there will be a reckoning. So that's the balance we're having to take. As far as the details of this specific plan, there's going to be more negotiation, I think, but I think perhaps it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I would note that two AI scholars, I always like to make it clear that it's you guys that actually do things and make things happen and make the tough decisions, but AI scholars can help. And two AI scholars, Michael Strain and Glenn Hubbard, helped design the PPP, which did have a positive effect of keeping people employed and during a very difficult time. Representative Banks, so are you in agreement that there's something needs to be done during this crisis, but that debt and deficit is still to be tackled in the future? And while I'm on that, let me just ask a follow-up. We have a scholar at AI who has done some work on broadening the base for revenue purposes, maybe even including a consumption tax or some way of raising revenues. Is there any way the RSC could, given the debt and the deficit, supporting any kind of methods of increasing revenue to the federal government in the future, given how much we owe and have committed to?
Yeah, let me first answer your first question. Yes, we should do more. And extending the Paycheck Protection Program, as Mike Johnson said, is a common sense move forward that had bipartisan support before, but has been held hostage by Speaker Pelosi ever since. There's still billions of dollars left unspent that we've appropriated to PPP, but because it hasn't been extended, it expired. Those dollars are just sitting in Washington when it could be they could be used to support businesses in Indiana, Louisiana, and elsewhere. Mitch Daniels, who was a governor of Indiana, well known, I'm sure, to all of you, used to say that living next door to Illinois is like living next door to the Simpsons. And when it comes to these radical Democrats, all the spending deals that are coming from Democrats would force taxpayers in Indiana to offset deficits and fiscal irresponsibility that date back decades before the pandemic for states like Illinois, that Hoosier taxpayers and taxpayers in Louisiana and elsewhere would have to pay for. And that's what I can't support is what's come out. Even the bipartisan deal yesterday would reward fiscal irresponsibility in some states and put the onus on the backs of taxpayers in states like mine who have been responsible, who put forth balanced budgets every 2 years at our state houses. That's what I can't support moving forward. As far as your latter question about additional revenues and other places that we can go to offset the deficit and now the $27 trillion national debt, Republican Study Committee put together a plan. We will send it to you, Robert, that we put forth a year and a half ago. That cuts wasteful spending, that reforms entitlement programs, and without having to increase taxes anywhere across the board. So we show how it can be done. In the next term, we're going to have to fight even harder to put forth those ideals of fiscal responsibility. I'm the first to admit that Republicans have fallen flat on their face when it comes to the mantle of being the party of fiscal responsibility. Yesterday, Republicans chose our new leader of the Budget Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri, who is a strong conservative. And it'll be his job as ranking member in the upcoming term to advocate for a fiscally responsible Republican budget. And then when we get the majority in 2 years, it'll be his job to pass that leadership test of putting forth a budget, doing what Democrats have failed to do over the last term after Pelosi famously said and challenged Republicans when we were in the majority to put forth a budget. And when we failed to do that, Pelosi attacked us for it. Democrats in the last term did not put forth any budget at all out of their budget committee. When we get the majority back, it will be our main responsibility to put forth a budget. And I know that Jason Smith from Missouri will do that when he's chair of the committee in 2 years.
Representative Banks, I'm glad you mentioned the tension and different choices between Illinois and Indiana. My older brother runs a manufacturing company in Indiana. He came from Illinois, and his 3 adult children have all moved to join him from Illinois to Indiana because of the more business-friendly, better schools, better governing environment in Indiana. So you've got a point there that's come clear in my own family. Now, I want to stick with you for just a minute more and ask about China. Here's an area where President Trump's approach seems to have convinced the country as a whole that we need to be, let's just say, tougher on China in a variety of ways, whether it's tariffs or protecting Taiwan and Hong Kong. Where do you feel is the place you would like to see the country go in continuing that application of pressure on China in the coming years?
Yeah, Robert, I would continue that the country is already there. It's Washington that's catching up with the rest of the country, and that's what President Trump taught us. I mean, for those of us who are longtime movement ideological conservatives, this was hard for us to wrap our minds around our free trade ideals with holding China accountable for unfair trade practices, and that's what one at the top of the list. One of the areas that I appreciate most about President Trump's leadership over the last 4 years is teaching us that catching up with the rest of the country that the country wants us to hold in a very bipartisan, strong bipartisan way They want Congress and the administration to hold China accountable. And this is where I'm really worried about the sharp turn of a Biden administration, and contrast that with where the Trump administration has been. The Trump administration hasn't been perfect, but what we're hearing from President-elect Biden is an opposite message of what we've heard from President Trump, in a policy of appeasement toward China versus the accountability and pressure that the Trump administration has tried to put forth toward China. So Republican Study Committee needs to fill the vacuum. We need to be out there. I served on the China Task Force effort last term. I served on the Armed Services Committee. I mean, this is, if we identify and recognize that China is the greatest existential threat that America faces economically and militarily, then Congress needs to react to that in a bigger way than what we have. And RSC has put forth a number of proposals in this area, and I expect that over the next couple of years, we will continue to make this a primary focus. Once again, though, I mean, there's the policy of it, the importance of it, but when it comes to the conservative movement, holding China accountable needs to be a pinnacle piece of who we are as conservatives, to build the winning coalition that President Trump taught us that we need to build to win majorities and to win the White House in 2024. China needs to be a big part of that platform.
Representative Johnson, we're talking a little bit about politics and carrying the country in the future elections. This election was interesting in that Republicans did very well in the House, including gaining, I think, 11 or 12 seats, depending on the outcome of a couple not yet called elections. And I also gather that there was a big influx of new, young, maybe not young, but women into the Republican caucus. And I just would ask you, looking at the RSC and looking at these new members, do you think you will get many of them to join the Republican Study Committee? Are these going to be conservative women joining the Republican caucus? And the other question we have from the audience, if you might address, is how does the Republican Study Committee differ from the Freedom Caucus, which we hear so much about, where the Republican Study Committee is sort of a little more focused on the details? But tell us the difference.
Yeah, great questions. First, we are super excited about this incoming class. It's the most diverse ever that we've had as a Republican Party. And that was by design. There was a real effort to go out and recruit outstanding candidates, and so many of them got elected. And we're delighted about it. We've already spent time, Jim and I both have spent time with this incoming class, these individual members. I think most of them will have an interest in joining RSC. It's not an automatic. They're chosen and given an invitation, but we're going to have the vast majority of this class, I think, will be a part of the group. And we're excited about that because they bring a lot to the table. With regard to the difference between Freedom Caucus and the Republican Study Committee, Freedom Caucus is a little bit smaller group. We have the largest caucus of conservatives, but the philosophy is aligned almost exactly. In fact, we have a huge crossover. So I think in this Congress, probably 75 or 80% or more of Freedom Caucus members were also members of RSC. The tactics differ sometimes, and that's great, but I don't think there was any daylight between the two groups at all in the last Congress. And Andy Biggs is current chairman of the Freedom Caucus. He's a classmate of Jim and mine, and one of my closest friends, and we work on strategy together almost daily. We're aligned in that way, and so it just is a further strength to have more of those voices in the room, and we aim to implement that. What we've tried to do at RSC over the last 2 years, and this is my proposition, Robert, when I ran for chairman, as I said, I feel like in some ways we came in, Jim and I came in as freshmen when President Trump came into office, and that was an interesting time. The last 4 years have been an interesting time in American politics, as we all know. We're in uncharted waters. Yeah, just the understatement of the century. Yeah. But in some ways, the landmarks have been moved, and so there's been this idea. AEI has talked about it a lot. All of our groups on the conservative spectrum is what does the conservative movement look like going forward? Who are we? How do we define what it is to be a conservative? How do we make a pitch to a millennial in an elevator to explain to them why our philosophy is superior to socialism or all these other competing ideas? And what I proposed to the group 2 years ago when I took the gavel was I said, we have to break this thing down to the foundations. We have to remember the core principles of conservatism and remember that we are here to advance those. And what are they? I love what Ronald Reagan said in his farewell address. I paraphrase him all the time, but he said, they call me the great communicator, but I wasn't that. I was just communicating great things. And they're the same great things that have guided the country since its founding. They don't change. See, that's the beauty of being a conservative. The timeless, eternal truths don't change. And what are they? This is my proposition. 7 core principles. I said it's individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. And under each of those, there are lots of subcategories. For example, under human dignity is the sanctity of every human life, as Banks was talking about earlier. So the idea is, Robert, summarize it with this: when we bring in new members, when we calibrate what we're doing at the largest caucus of Republicans in Congress at RSC, when we move forward with policy initiatives, when we publish the conservative playbook for Republican-led Congress, all of that is grounded in those core principles. And when we have the new member development meetings, I just got elected vice chairman of the Republican conference, and I'm talking with the leadership about how we want to have some seminars, new member seminars, to help them think through what this looks like. Some of these new freshmen coming in have never been legislators before. They've never had to put their philosophy into practice, and so we want to help them through that. And I think by doing that, we're going to, I think, train up a new generation of leaders in Congress, and it's going to be very effective in the years ahead.
Representative Banks, Representative Johnson just mentioned those tenets, and I'm going to ask you both about two of them. One of them is limited government, and here was an area where some conservatives might say that President Trump challenged that tenet. He was more of a bigger government guy, it seemed to me, in sort of a desire for kind of national industrial policy. And one of the areas that's also come up is in family policy, where the Trump administration has been more inclined to be supportive of something like family leave mandates and things of that sort. Another area that's happening right now, and I want to ask you specifically about it because the President-elect Biden's team has said they support it as well, is a significant increase to the child tax allowance, the child allowance in the tax code. Now, Senator Lee and Senator Romney have said that they support something along those lines. The Democrats will insist that include full refundability all the way down to people who pay no taxes and already get significant transfer payments to help them shore up their income through the EITC and food stamps and other benefits. Is the Republican Study Committee going to point out that additional cost that comes with a child tax allowance? Where are you on this child tax allowance, and where are you on making it refundable all the way, even to people who already get significant benefits?
Yeah, Robert, first and foremost, when we look at a $27 trillion national debt and what that means to the future of this country, my daughters today are 11, 9, and 7 years old. What the debt that their generation is inheriting, that's only going to continue to grow if we don't do something about it. We have to recognize that we can't pass more irresponsible spending moving forward. And this is a good example of what this is a great example of what RSC does. To get into the mechanics of what we do on a daily basis, we have a staff of about 10 individuals who work hard every day for RSC. This is also one of the differences between RSC and other conservative caucuses on the Hill, is the talented team of staff that we have that put out policy analysis of every single piece of legislation that comes to a vote on the floor. And a part of that analysis is a fiscal impact, and what every bill would do to increase the size and scope of government or to decrease it. And if there are conservative concerns, that's laid out in the legislative analysis. When members of Congress become members of RSC, that's what they're paying for. They're paying for a lot of things, but the most important investment that they're making is in this legislative analysis that our sharp, talented team that's second to none on Capitol Hill writes. They spend hours writing it, and it goes to members of Congress. And this is a good example of where they would provide analysis on extending or growing tax credits like these, and tell us what it would do to increase spending, increase the deficit and debt even further. And I promise you, Robert, that RSC will be on the front lines of this debate and exposing the results of what programs like this would do to the future of this country when it comes to deficits and debts and spending even further.
And then for both of you, and maybe Congressman Johnson, if you want to start on the rule of law, commitment to the rule of law, and conservatives generally have a sort of a commitment to tradition and order and respect for institutions. And all of that is coming into question a little bit in the wake of this election. And there's some really serious tensions in the Republican Party now with the Arizona governor and the Georgia governor and the Wall Street Journal editorial page in very intense conflict with the president's behavior concerning the proper turning over of power. Where do you think conservatives should be on that issue, especially as the president's team appears not to be able to win any court case anywhere? Where does that stand with regard to your respect for the rule of law?
This is a great struggle, and one of the things that keeps us up at night, in addition to the increasing debt that we have in this country, is the decreasing faith that people have in our institutions. You said it very well, and one of the things that's presupposed in a constitutional republic is that the people have to have this idea that their institutions are reliable and trustworthy and fair. If you're going to have a government of, by, and for the people, we don't have a king in this country. The people are the sovereigns themselves. It's the consent of the governed. And if the governed don't believe that the power structures that are in place are fair and equitable, then our whole house of cards falls. I mean, that's, a constitutional republic is a fragile thing, really. And it relies upon the faith in these institutions. So when you have an election that people have no confidence in, when they see and hear incidences of fraud and on a broad basis that are credible, it makes them doubt. It makes them wonder whether they should take the time to go and vote again in the future at all. And it's a great concern to all of us. So I've been one that I'm a constitutional law attorney, my background, and I've spoken to the president myself about this over the last couple of weeks since the election, encouraging him to exhaust all the legal remedies, because I think it's so critically important. I think every American citizen, every voter is owed that, whoever they voted for president, because we have to root out the fraud and the irregularity and all that, and make sure, even if this current election is not capable of being overturned now, and it's probably not, that's the reality. We have to make sure that this does not happen again in the future. And one of the things that we've been railing against.
He has exhausted his legal remedies and he's not winning. So but he says he won't concede even then. Isn't that doing some damage to the confidence people should have in their constitutional system? Previous presidents lost very bitter elections, but they conceded for the sake of preserving order and recognizing the importance of the toleration of the opposition and a peaceful transfer of power.
No, he has to do that. There's no question about that. But the only question is, what is the appropriate time? Is it right now, or do you wait until the final case is resolved? And I'm in that camp. The president said clearly in his own words, just I think it was a few days ago at the White House, that he will obviously participate in the peaceful transfer of power, and he'll leave the White House in the appropriate time and all that. But the distinction between this election and all previous ones is that you didn't have this level of fraud alleged in so many places at one time. The incidence of COVID and the rapid or the big increase in the mail-in absentee ballots that were used in this election cycle is unprecedented, and that is where the problem lies. And so we've got to make sure that all these questions are not lingering, not hanging over our election system going forward, because exactly what you said, the people are going to lose faith in it. I'm literally getting text messages right now, Robert, while we're talking, people that are not watching our program right now, constituents of mine who are texting me, it's coming across the top of my phone, on this subject. Stand with the president, make sure the election is fair and all that. They're out there, the rank and file, a lot of Republicans are deeply concerned about this, and we've got to root out the fraud.
Congressman Banks, so during the past several years, one of the heroes of the conservative movement has been the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr. Clearly stood up, taken some really tough stands, has incurred the wrath of the progressive left in a really unpleasant way. Yesterday, he said there's no evidence of fraud, and now the president and his people are attacking him. How do you react to the Attorney General's comments from yesterday?
Well, I appreciate that the Attorney General made the comments, and if he is saying that he and the Department of Justice can't identify fraud, I think we should take those comments very seriously. But Robert, let me say this: at the very outset of this Congress, when Nancy Pelosi took the gavel and the Democrats took the majority, they symbolically introduced their very first bill, HR1, which is symbolic. That means that this is their top priority piece of legislation when they name it HR1. And this was January of 2019, long before COVID-19, long before the pandemic. HR1 was a piece of legislation that would nationalize elections and push all states toward mail-in ballots. This was their strategy way 2 years ago, long before the pandemic. They passed it out of the House. The Senate obviously didn't move it forward, and they used the guise of the pandemic in many states and states with Democrat governors and Democrat state houses to expand mail-in ballots and use mail-in ballots to their advantage. And that's one of the reasons, as Mike Johnson is saying, so many Americans have lost faith in our institutions and they've lost faith in the election process. There are things that we should do. We should recognize at the outset that we should look at ways that we should create standards for mail-in ballots, if not altogether eliminate the use of mail-in ballots to preserve the integrity and security of our elections. I've been working with my Secretary of State in Indiana on legislation that I've introduced that would require states, before receiving matching federal grants related to elections, that would match their voter rolls with Social Security databases. There are sensible pieces of legislation that we can advocate for that would return election integrity and security back to our elections, and I think preserve the American trust in our elections process. And I want RSC to be in the middle of that debate, and I want to find ways that RSC over the next couple of years can advocate and advance legislation that might do exactly that.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question on this of you, Representative Johnson from Louisiana, where there's a long history of federal intervention in local elections. And with the Shelby case in the Supreme Court, when the court just ended Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because it was a too aggressive at this time intrusion of federal power into local elections. Given what's happened, are you open to reconsidering a larger role of the federal government in elections in the states?
I've been very resistant to it because I am an old school conservative, and there is a reason. Our federalism is important, and we have from time immemorial in this country we have trusted the states to handle the election process. But there's also a presupposition there that it will be done fairly and justifiably. And if that's a problem, then these are things that we have to look at. I'm not in favor of big federal intervention in elections, but I do think that the responsibility primarily falls with the state legislatures. And I think there's going to be a new resolve in the new year, certainly by the Republican-led legislatures, to clean this up and make sure this doesn't happen before. And let me just amend one thing that was said a moment ago, Robert, that the Attorney General Barr did say that they haven't seen fraud yet that would be sufficient to overturn the election. He also clarified, I think later that day, maybe last night, that they're not yet reached their final conclusion. They're looking into that. So we'll see. Most of this is an academic discussion now. I think everybody recognizes it's probably too late to overturn the election. But again, we have to exhaust every remedy. We have to exhaust every investigation and make sure we know exactly what happened here so that it doesn't happen again. That's the big issue.
Okay, so I do have a question from one of our listeners that I wanted to ask, and this concerns, given the debt and deficit issue, it brings us back to sort of the role of the House as the really builder of fiscal policy in the United States. Are you inclined, given the circumstance, to advocate for additional tax cuts? Is that something is there an area of the tax code that deserves further reform or reduction that the Republican Study Committee would entertain?
Which one of you? I'll jump in. I mean, look, I'll tell you as a general notion that we've been very consistent about that. We believe, if you rewind the clock to February before the coronavirus hit American shores, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world, not just the United States, but of the world. And there are reasons for that. It didn't happen by accident. It's because we reduced taxes and regulation largely, and we unleashed the American economy, the free enterprise system. We believe that in that general idea, in that philosophy, that principle, and I think the vast majority of RSC members will double down on that when given the opportunity. What we're going to be doing, obviously, for the next 2 years is playing a very vigorous defense, because we have the commitment by President-elect Biden and his team that they want to raise taxes, and we can't do that. It's exactly the opposite approach that we need, and so you'll see a vigorous defense of our policies and ideas, I think, in the next 2 years. I'll yield Jim because he's going to take the gavel from me.
Well, the first thing that we need to do is make the Trump tax cuts on the individual rates permanent. If Republicans really are the party of the working class and for working people, then we should have done that from the beginning. We made the corporate tax cuts permanent, but we sunset the individual rates at 10 years. And I think that was one of the big misses of tax reform, in an area that Republicans need to go back to make the individual rates cuts permanent. As Mike Johnson is saying, though, the next 4 years likely will be fighting against the progressive left who want to repeal the Trump tax cuts altogether. So that's a fight that Republican Study Committee will be in the middle of, I assure you, over the next couple of years.
One thing that was clear in the election, at least to me, was that the working class Americans were positive about the state of the economy before COVID. That the unemployment rate, the poverty rate, the ratio of people to employment was at all-time best achievements, and median income was rising. Given that the Vice President Biden's bringing in sort of the team from President Obama's economic policy, do you think they have it in them to get us back to an economy of late 2019? Or what's your view of where their policies will lead us?
I would like to think so, but it's hard for me to see that the economic advisors of the president who did the most damage to the working class, perhaps in modern times, would be willing to learn or take a page from the Trump playbook, who they despised so much that they campaigned against in this last campaign cycle. So that's an area where I hope that Republicans can seize the mantle and spend the next 2 years as we fight to win back the House majority, and the next 4 years as we fight to win back the White House, to remind the American people that the Republican Party and the policies of the Republican Party are on the side of the working class, and the Democrat Party is not.
Representative Johnson, do you have a comment on that? And also speak to the nature of your districts. Do you represent working class districts, and are your voters coming from people whose incomes are lower than the traditional old sort of view of Republicans as the party of the rich?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I would say that I do believe that the bright spot, the silver lining of this election outcome for the presidential election, is that with Biden and Kamala Harris in charge, we'll have the opportunity to draw a very stark contrast between the policies that we implemented and pursued in the Trump administration and what they're going to propose and try to do with Pelosi and the rise of socialism in the House. We're going to have a very distinct contrast to draw, and we really like that going into 2022 because we have a lot to message. We can show what we've done and what the results of our policies were, and that means a lot in a district like mine and in Jim's too. I mean, I'm in Northwest Louisiana. My district is 15 parishes or counties in Louisiana. It's about a third of the state by land area. There's a lot of rural area. We're one of the lower on the economic scale. Median household income is relatively low. Louisiana is largely one of the least best off states. How can I say that charitably? I don't want to say I'm in a poor state.
Great people.
Great people. I think we got the greatest people in the world, and our state has the greatest natural resources, arguably, of any state. We have all the conditions here to be number one on the list of every economy. But what's held us back is wrong-headed policies on the state level and decades of graft and corruption and all that. We've been changing it here, but we have to have the conditions set on the federal level to allow our state to compete well and best. And then it's up to us at the state level to adjust our economic policies here to make it work. My people desire that. They appreciate the opportunity that they love President Trump because of what he did for them. As you said, their household incomes went up. They had more economic opportunity and more economic mobility for more people. The pathway out of poverty was broadened for more people, and they saw that. They experienced it themselves. And many of our longtime Democrats scratched their heads and said, my goodness, maybe there is something to this. We have, as Jim has indicated earlier, we have to seize upon that now as the Republican Party and make that compelling case to working class Americans, middle class, that we are the party that can best represent your interest and give you and your family better opportunity. Well, the truth is on our side, and we are anxious to make those arguments.
Congressman Banks, last word for you on this or anything else you would like to tell us about the coming years.
Yeah, Robert, I represent the district with the most manufacturing jobs per capita of any district in the country in Northeast Indiana. Much of it's automotive. My dad, by the way, is an example of the working class voter who's not a traditional Republican, but who loves President Trump and came to the Republican Party more firmly than ever because of President Trump. And for Republicans to win in the future, we got to keep voters like my dad in the fold. I tell people all the time, I got elected to Congress 4 years ago. The same election night, my brother got elected to a local office. My dad was more excited about Donald Trump winning the White House than he was either of his sons winning.
Oh.
And if we're going to win majorities, if we're going to win the White House, we've got to keep working class voters in the fold. And President Trump taught us how to do it. I think the China subject is a key part of this. My dad, when I was a kid, NAFTA was a 4-letter word as well. And the USMCA, while many can argue that it's just extending or reforming NAFTA, the fact that President Trump spent time renegotiating and drafting trade deals that put American workers first, those are areas that are hard for free trade traditional conservatives to wrap their heads around. But I think we have to learn a few of these lessons if we're going to be a politically viable party, and if the conservative movement is going to be a winning movement in the future too. And that's the conversation I want RSC to focus on the next couple of years with Trump out of the White House. What can we learn from him? What are the lessons that we learned from the Trump era that can help our movement sharpen ourselves and grow our movement moving forward? There's no better place to have that conversation, I believe, than at the Republican Study Committee.
Well, this has been a great conversation with two distinguished members of the House of Representatives. I'm very honored to have you with us this morning, and I greatly appreciate your service to our country. Thank you all very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.